The smell of grilled seafood and fresh ocean breeze mixed together as David wiped down the last table on the outdoor deck. Saturday nights at the Blue Pearl restaurant were always busy, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the perfect weather, or maybe it was just one of those nights when everything seemed to flow just right. David had been working at this upscale beachfront restaurant for 8 months now, and he genuinely loved it. Sure, it wasn't his dream job, but it paid well and gave him the flexibility he needed for his studies. At 28, he was older than most of the other servers, but that never bothered him. If anything, his maturity helped him handle difficult situations better than some of his younger coworkers. The restaurant sat right on the harbor, with huge windows that gave diners a perfect view of the sunset over the water. White tablecloths, polished silverware, and soft jazz music created an atmosphere that attracted well-dressed tourists and locals celebrating special occasions. The prices weren't cheap, but people came here for the experience as much as the food. David straightened his black vest and checked his watch. 6:30. The dinner rush would start soon, and he could already see his manager, Roberto, seating the first wave of evening guests. David liked Roberto. The man was fair, treated his staff well, and always had their backs when customers got out of line. "David, you've got table 12 tonight," Roberto called out, pointing to a prime spot on the deck overlooking the marina. "It's a four-top, and they specifically requested outdoor seating." "Got it," David replied, grabbing fresh menus and checking that his section was ready. Table 12 was one of the best tables in the house, with an unobstructed view of the harbor and the setting sun. The kind of table that usually meant good tips, especially on a perfect evening like this. David had learned to read people quickly in this job. Most customers fell into predictable categories. There were the young couples on dates, nervous and trying to impress each other. The families with kids who just wanted to get through dinner without major disasters. The business groups who talked loudly about deals and drank expensive wine. And then there were the tourists who came in all varieties. Some tourists were wonderful. They were excited to try local cuisine, asked thoughtful questions about the area, and tipped well because they were on vacation and feeling generous. Others were more challenging. They expected everything to be exactly like home, complained about prices, and seemed to think that being on vacation gave them permission to be demanding. Tonight, David was feeling optimistic. He'd had a good week at school, his research project was going well, and he'd managed to save a decent amount of money. His PhD program in local history was expensive, but working at the Blue Pearl helped him cover his expenses without taking on more student debt. The restaurant was starting to fill up now. David could see familiar faces among the servers, bussers, and kitchen staff. They'd become like a second family to him over the months. There was Carmen, the lead server who'd trained him when he first started. She could handle any situation with grace and had taught him most of what he knew about reading customers. There was Tony behind the bar, who made the best cocktails on the coast and always had a joke ready to lighten the mood during stressful shifts. David's phone buzzed with a text from his study group, confirming their Monday meeting. He smiled, thinking about how different his two worlds were. During the day, he spent hours in libraries and archives researching local maritime history and writing papers about the economic development of coastal communities. At night, he served those same communities, learning about them in a completely different way. The sun was getting lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. This was always David's favorite time of day at the restaurant. The harsh afternoon light softened, the temperature cooled slightly, and there was something magical about watching people enjoy themselves against the backdrop of the harbor. He checked his tables one more time, making sure the salt and pepper shakers were full. The flowers were fresh and everything was spotless. David took pride in his work regardless of what it was. His grandmother had taught him that any job worth doing was worth doing well, and he'd carried that lesson with him through everything in life. Roberto appeared at his elbow with a knowing look. "Your four-top is here. They look like they have money to spend." David glanced toward the hostess station and saw them. Two well-dressed couples, probably in their 50s, wearing the kind of expensive casual clothes that screamed money. Designer polo shirts, perfectly pressed khakis, jewelry that caught the light. The women carried handbags that probably cost more than David made in a month. "They're visitors from up north," Roberto continued quietly, "staying at the Grand Harbor Hotel. The hostess said they want the best table and the best service." David nodded. He'd served plenty of wealthy guests before, and most of them were perfectly pleasant once you showed them you knew what you were doing. The key was confidence and attention to detail. Rich people were used to good service, and they appreciated it when someone could deliver without fawning all over them. "I've got this," David said, straightening his tie and grabbing a pitcher of ice water. As he walked toward table 12, David noticed how the couples carried themselves. There was something about their posture, the way they looked around the restaurant, that suggested they were used to being the most important people in any room they entered. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing, David told himself. Confident customers often knew exactly what they wanted and didn't waste time with indecision. The evening was just beginning, and David had no reason to think it would be anything other than routine. In a few hours, he'd go home with good tips, maybe grab a late dinner and spend some time reviewing notes for Monday's class. It was a good life, balancing his passion for learning with the practical need to pay bills. The ocean sparkled in the distance, boats bobbed gently in the marina, and the first evening stars were beginning to appear. David took a deep breath of the salt air and prepared to welcome his new guests to what he hoped would be a memorable evening at the Blue Pearl. David approached table 12 with his usual professional smile, water pitcher in hand and menus tucked under his arm. The 4 guests had settled into their chairs and were looking out at the harbor view with obvious satisfaction. The sunset was particularly beautiful tonight, and David was genuinely excited to help them have a great evening. "Good evening, folks. Welcome to the Blue Pearl," David said warmly as he began filling their water glasses. "I'm David, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. How are you all doing?" The response wasn't what he expected. Instead of the usual friendly greetings he was used to, one of the men looked up at him with an expression that made David's stomach tighten slightly. It wasn't hostile exactly, but there was something dismissive in his eyes, like he was looking at something rather than someone. "We're fine," the man said curtly. "We want to see wine lists immediately, and we don't want to wait around all night for service. We're paying good money to be here." David kept his smile in place. He'd dealt with impatient customers before. Sometimes people were stressed from travel or just having a bad day. "Of course, sir. Let me get those wine lists for you right away. In the meantime, can I tell you about our fresh catch of the day?" "Just get the wine lists," the man interrupted, not even looking at David. "We'll figure out the food ourselves." The woman sitting next to him laughed, but not in a kind way. "Honey, you have to speak slowly and clearly. He probably doesn't understand complicated orders." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. The comment hit him like a slap, but he forced himself to stay calm. Maybe he'd misunderstood. Maybe she was talking about something else. He'd give them the benefit of the doubt. "I'll be right back with those wine lists," David said, keeping his voice steady and professional. As he walked away, he heard the woman whisper something to her companion that made both couples chuckle. David couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. He'd heard that tone before growing up, and it never meant anything good. David retrieved the wine lists from behind the bar, taking a moment to collect himself. Tony noticed his expression and raised an eyebrow questioningly, but David just shook his head slightly. He'd handled worse situations before. These people were probably just having a bad day or were used to a different style of service. He'd prove himself through excellent service and everything would be fine. When he returned to the table, the foursome was deep in conversation about their day of shopping and sightseeing. David waited for a natural pause before approaching, then placed the wine lists on the table with a smile. "Here are your wine lists. We have an excellent selection of local wines, and our sommelier has made some great recommendations that pair beautifully with our seafood specialties." The second man, who'd been quiet until now, looked up at David with obvious annoyance. "Do you even know what a sommelier is? Or are you just reading from some script they gave you?" David felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his composure. "Yes, sir, I'm familiar with wine service. I'd be happy to get our sommelier if you'd prefer to speak with him directly." "That would be better," the first woman said, examining her nails. "We're used to a certain level of sophistication in our dining experiences." The second woman nodded in agreement. "It's nothing personal, honey. It's just that we're celebrating our anniversary, and we want everything to be perfect." "You understand." David understood perfectly, but not in the way she meant. He understood that these people had already decided he wasn't capable of providing the level of service they expected, based on nothing more than looking at him. He understood that they were testing him, waiting for him to prove their assumptions right by getting flustered or making mistakes. "I completely understand wanting your anniversary celebration to be special," David replied graciously. "Let me get Michael, our sommelier, and I'll also bring you some of our signature appetizers to enjoy while you're deciding on wine." "We didn't order appetizers," the first man said sharply. "They're complimentary, sir. We like to start our guests off with a little taste of what makes the Blue Pearl special." The man exchanged a look with his wife that David didn't like. "Free food, huh? Well, I guess that's about right for this level of service." David pretended not to hear the comment and went to find Michael. The sommelier was a friendly guy in his 30s who knew more about wine than anyone David had ever met. He was also one of the most patient people on staff, which David hoped would help with this situation. "Table 12 wants to speak with you about wine pairings," David explained. "They're celebrating an anniversary, so they want something special." "Sure thing," Michael said, adjusting his tie. "Anniversaries are fun. What's the vibe like over there?" David hesitated. "Just be your usual charming self. They seem to appreciate expertise." Michael headed over to the table while David prepared the complimentary appetizer tray. He arranged the small portions of crab cakes, stuffed mushrooms, and shrimp cocktail with extra care, making sure the presentation was perfect. Whatever these people thought about him, they couldn't complain about the food or service. When David returned to the table, Michael was in full sommelier mode, describing different wine regions and flavor profiles with obvious passion. The four guests were hanging on his every word, asking intelligent questions and nodding appreciatively. It was like watching a completely different group of people. David set down the appetizer tray quietly, not wanting to interrupt the wine discussion. But the first man noticed him and held up a hand. "Excuse me," he said to Michael, "but can you make sure our actual server understands our dietary restrictions? My wife is allergic to shellfish and we can't have any cross-contamination issues." David looked at the shrimp cocktail he'd just placed on the table and felt his heart sink. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Let me remove this immediately and make sure the kitchen knows about your allergy." "This is exactly what I was worried about," the woman said, pushing her chair back from the table as if the shrimp might jump off the plate and attack her. "This is why we needed someone who actually pays attention to details." "It's an honest mistake," Michael said diplomatically. "David's one of our most careful servers. I'm sure he just didn't realize about the allergy since you hadn't ordered yet." "That's the point," the second man said. "A professional would have asked about allergies before bringing anything to the table." David quickly removed the appetizer tray, his face burning with embarrassment. The man was right, of course. He should have asked about allergies before bringing anything. It was basic restaurant protocol, and he'd been so focused on trying to impress them that he'd skipped an important step. "You're absolutely right, sir. That was my mistake. Let me get you a fresh selection that's completely safe for everyone at the table." As David walked back toward the kitchen, he could hear the table continuing their conversation with Michael about wine pairings. Their whole demeanor had changed the moment he left their vicinity. They were animated, friendly, and enthusiastic with the sommelier, but the second David appeared, they became cold and critical. Carmen appeared beside him at the service station. "How's table 12 treating you?" David forced a smile. "They're just particular about service. Nothing I can't handle." But as he prepared a new appetizer selection, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be a very long evening. David returned to table 12 with a carefully selected new appetizer tray, double-checking that everything was shellfish-free. He'd spoken with the chef personally to ensure there was no cross-contamination, and he'd memorized every ingredient in each dish. This time there would be no mistakes. "Here's a fresh selection that's completely safe for everyone," David announced, setting down the new tray. "We have bacon-wrapped scallops, stuffed mushrooms with herbs and cheese, and our signature bruschetta with fresh tomatoes and basil." The woman with the shellfish allergy looked at the plate suspiciously. "Are you sure about the scallops? Those seem like seafood to me." David felt his confidence waver. Scallops were shellfish, weren't they? Or were they mollusks? He knew the difference academically, but suddenly he wasn't sure about the restaurant's policy for shellfish allergies. "Let me double-check with the kitchen about the scallops," David said, reaching for the plate. "Oh, for crying out loud," the first man said loudly enough that other diners turned to look. "This is ridiculous. How can you work in a seafood restaurant and not know what shellfish are?" The second man shook his head in disgust. "This is what happens when restaurants hire people who don't have proper training. It's actually dangerous. David felt his face burning as he realized his mistake. Scallops were indeed mollusks, not crustaceans, but many people with shellfish allergies were allergic to both. He should have asked more detailed questions about her specific allergies instead of making assumptions. "You're absolutely right, and I apologize," David said, removing the entire tray again. "Let me get you something that's definitely safe, and I'll have our chef speak with you directly about your specific dietary needs." "Finally," the first woman said. "Someone with some sense. Though why it takes 3 tries to get basic food safety right is beyond me." As David walked away with the rejected appetizers, he could hear them talking about him again. This time they weren't bothering to whisper. "I don't understand why they put someone like that in charge of tables like this," one of the women said. "We're spending serious money here." "It's probably some kind of diversity program," the other woman replied. "They have to hire a certain number of people whether they're qualified or not." David stopped walking. The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He'd suspected what they were thinking, but hearing it said out loud made everything crystal clear. They weren't judging his service or his knowledge. They were judging him. Roberto appeared at David's side, noticing his expression. "Everything okay over there?" David wanted to tell him everything, but he also knew how these situations usually played out. The customers would deny saying anything inappropriate, claim they were just concerned about food safety, and somehow David would end up looking like the problem. "They have some specific allergy concerns," David said carefully. "Could you have Chef Rodriguez speak with them directly?" "Of course. But David, you look upset. What's really going on?" Before David could answer, he heard a sharp clapping sound from table 12. The first man was snapping his fingers in the air, looking directly at David with obvious impatience. "Excuse me, we've been waiting here for 10 minutes. Are we going to get service or not?" Other diners were definitely staring now. David could feel their eyes on him as he walked back to the table, his professional smile feeling more forced with each step. "Chef Rodriguez will be right out to discuss your dietary needs," David said. "In the meantime, would you like to start with some drinks while you look over the menu?" "We already ordered wine with the sommelier," the second man said dismissively. "What we need is for someone to take our dinner order who actually knows what they're doing." "I'd be happy to take your order, sir." The first woman looked up from her menu with barely concealed annoyance. "Honey, can you even read this menu? Some of these words are pretty complicated." David stared at her for a moment, not trusting himself to speak immediately. The insult was so blatant, so unnecessary that it took his breath away. Around them, other diners were pretending not to listen, but David could feel their discomfort. "Yes, ma'am, I can read the menu," David said quietly. "I'm also familiar with all of our preparations and ingredients if you have any questions." "I doubt that," the second man said with a laugh. "But let's test it out." "What's in the bouillabaisse?" David knew this dish by heart. It was one of the restaurant's signature items, and he'd served it dozens of times. It's a traditional Provençal fish stew with fresh local fish, mussels, shrimp, scallops, and clams in a saffron-scented tomato broth, served with rouille and crusty bread. The man said, looking disappointed that David had answered correctly. "And what's rouille?" "It's a spicy mayonnaise-based sauce with garlic, saffron, and red peppers, traditionally served with bouillabaisse." The man exchanged glances with his companions. Lucky guess. At that moment, Chef Rodriguez appeared at the table, his friendly smile and professional demeanor immediately changing the atmosphere. The 4 guests straightened up and became suddenly charming and polite. "Good evening, folks. I understand you have some allergy concerns I can help with?" For the next 10 minutes, David watched as the same people who had been treating him with open contempt became warm and engaging with the chef. They asked thoughtful questions, made jokes, and complimented the restaurant. It was like watching actors switch roles. When Chef Rodriguez left, their masks came off again. The first man looked at David with renewed irritation. "All right, let's get this over with. I want the lobster thermidor, but I want to make sure it's prepared properly. Can you handle writing that down, or should we wait for someone else?" David pulled out his order pad, his hand trembling slightly with suppressed anger. "Lobster thermidor. Would you like that with the standard preparation?" "Do you even know what the standard preparation is?" the woman asked. David looked up from his pad and met her eyes directly. For a moment he considered telling her exactly what he thought of her and her friends. He considered explaining that he probably knew more about the history of lobster thermidor than she did. that he'd written papers on the development of French cuisine in America, that he spoke 3 languages and had read more books in the past month than she probably had all year. Instead, he took a deep breath and said, "Lobster thermidor is prepared with lobster meat in a rich sauce of egg yolks, brandy and mustard returned to the shell and broiled until golden. Our chef adds a touch of tarragon and serves it with seasonal vegetables." The man looked annoyed again that David had answered correctly. "Fine, and make sure it's not overcooked. I can't stand rubbery lobster." As David continued taking their orders, each request came with an insult or a test. They questioned his ability to remember their preferences, made jokes about his intelligence, and spoke to him like he was a child who might not understand basic concepts. The worst part was that other diners were watching. David could see the discomfort on some faces, the embarrassment that came from witnessing someone being treated so poorly. But no one said anything. They just looked away and focused on their own conversations. When David finally finished taking their orders and walked back toward the kitchen, he felt exhausted. His shift was only half over and he already felt like he'd been through a battle. Carmen intercepted him near the computer terminal where he was entering their order. "Those people are being awful to you," she said quietly. "I can see it from across the room." David appreciated her concern, but he also knew there wasn't much anyone could do. "They're just demanding customers. I can handle it." "No, David, what they're doing isn't about demanding service. I've been watching them and the way they talk to you versus how they talk to Michael and Chef Rodriguez. It's not okay." David knew she was right, but he also knew that pointing it out wouldn't change anything. These people had money. They were spending it at the restaurant and they would leave their reviews online regardless of how the situation was handled. The best he could do was get through the rest of their meal with his dignity intact. "Just help me make sure their food comes out perfectly," David said. "I don't want to give them any more ammunition." As their appetizers went out and their entrees were prepared, David found himself moving more carefully, double-checking everything, and trying to anticipate their next complaint. He felt like he was walking through a minefield, knowing that any small mistake would be magnified and used against him. The evening was far from over, and David had the sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. The entrees had been served, and for a brief moment David hoped the worst was over. The kitchen had outdone themselves with the presentation, and even he had to admit the dishes looked magnificent. The lobster thermidor was perfectly golden, the sea base was flaky and aromatic, and the steaks were cooked exactly to specification. But his relief was short-lived. Within minutes of serving the food, the complaints began. "This lobster is too salty," the first man announced, loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. "And the portion size is ridiculous for what we're paying." David looked at the plate. The man had barely touched the dish, taking only one small bite. "I'm sorry you're not satisfied, sir. Would you like me to have the chef prepare something else for you?" "What I'd like is competent service from the beginning," the man replied, pushing the plate away dramatically. "This whole evening has been one disaster after another." The second woman nodded in agreement. "The wine was served at the wrong temperature, the bread took forever to arrive, and now the food isn't even edible. This is supposed to be a high-end restaurant." David felt confused and frustrated. The wine had been served by Michael, who was meticulous about temperature. The bread had arrived within minutes of being seated, and the lobster thermidor looked identical to dozens of other plates he'd served that were received with enthusiasm. "Let me get the manager for you," David offered, knowing that Roberto would want to address their concerns directly. "Finally, someone with sense," the first woman said. "Though I have to say, it shouldn't take this long to figure out when you're in over your head." As David walked toward Roberto's office, he noticed that other servers were watching him with sympathetic expressions. Carmen gave him an encouraging nod, and even Tony behind the bar looked concerned. David realized that their behavior had become so obvious that the entire staff had noticed. Roberto was at his desk, reviewing the evening's reservations. "How's Table 12 doing?" he asked when David appeared. "They're not happy with their food and want to speak with you," David said. "But Roberto, I need you to know that this isn't really about the food or service. They've been treating me differently all evening, and I think you should be aware of what's happening before you go over there." Roberto looked up sharply. "What do you mean, treating you differently?" David chose his words carefully. "They've been questioning my intelligence, making comments about my qualifications and speaking to me in a way that they don't speak to other staff members. I've tried to handle it professionally, but I wanted you to know the context. Roberto's expression darkened. I see. Well, let's go handle this together. As they approached table 12, David could see the four guests had arranged themselves like they were preparing for battle. Their body language was aggressive, their expressions were stern, and they had clearly been rehearsing their complaints. Good evening, folks, Roberto said with his usual professional charm. I understand you have some concerns about your dining experience tonight. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. The four guests became warm, reasonable people with legitimate concerns about their meal. They spoke respectfully to Roberto, acknowledged that these things happen, and even complimented other aspects of their experience. The restaurant is lovely, and your sommelier was fantastic, the first woman said sweetly. It's just that our server seems to be having an off night. We don't want to get anyone in trouble, but we're celebrating our anniversary, and we hoped for better service. Of course, Roberto said smoothly. Let me personally ensure that the rest of your evening goes perfectly. David, why don't you take a quick break while I handle table 12 myself? David felt a mix of relief and humiliation. He was grateful to be removed from the situation, but he also felt like he was being punished for something that wasn't his fault. As he walked away, he could hear the guests praising Roberto and expressing their appreciation for his intervention. David went to the staff break area and sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs. He pulled out his phone and stared at it without really seeing the screen. The evening had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He'd dealt with difficult customers before, but this felt different. This felt personal. Carmen appeared in the doorway. Hey, you okay? I don't know, David said honestly. I keep wondering if I did something wrong, if there was some way I could have handled it better. David, you didn't do anything wrong. I watched the whole thing. Those people made up their minds about you the second you walked up to their table. But what if they're right? What if I'm not good enough for tables like that? Carmen sat down next to him. Listen to me. You're one of the best servers we have. You know the menu better than anyone, except maybe Roberto. You speak multiple languages, you're getting a PhD, and you treat every customer with respect even when they don't deserve it. Don't let those people make you question yourself. David appreciated her words, but he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he should just request different sections from now on. Maybe he should stick to the less prominent tables where expectations weren't as high. Roberto wants to see you in his office when you're ready, Carmen said gently. David made his way to Roberto's office, expecting to be told that he'd be moved to a different section or maybe sent home early. Instead, Roberto was sitting at his desk with a thoughtful expression. Close the door and sit down, Roberto said. We need to talk. David sat down, his stomach churning. I'm sorry about tonight. I know I made some mistakes with the appetizers, and maybe I should have handled their complaints differently. Roberto held up a hand. Stop, you didn't do anything wrong. In fact, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. David waited, confused. How much do you know about this restaurant's history? Roberto asked. I know it's been here for about 15 years, and it's always been upscale dining focused on local seafood. Why? Roberto smiled, but there was something mysterious about his expression. What if I told you that you knew more about this place than you think you do? I'm not sure what you mean. David, what exactly is your PhD research focused on? I know it's local history, but what specifically are you studying? Maritime commerce and economic development in coastal communities, David said, still confused about where this was going. I'm particularly interested in how fishing and tourism industries shaped local business development in the early 20th century. Roberto nodded slowly. And what time period are you focusing on? Mainly 1920 to 1950, when a lot of the foundational businesses in this area were established. Roberto opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick folder. David, I think it's time you learned something about where you work. He opened the folder and pulled out an old photograph. It showed a group of men in 1920s clothing, standing in front of a building that David recognized immediately. It was the same building they were sitting in, but it looked different. Younger, newer. This building was constructed in 1923, Roberto said. It was originally a private dining club for local business leaders and investors. The man in the center of this photograph was one of the founding members. David looked at the photograph more closely. The man Roberto was pointing to was wearing a formal suit and had a confident expression. There was something familiar about his face, something that made David's heart skip a beat. Roberto, why are you showing me this? Roberto smiled. Because, David, that man's name was Thomas Williams. And according to the historical records I've been researching since I hired you, Thomas Williams was your great-great-grandfather. David stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. That's impossible. How could you know that? I didn't know for sure until tonight, when you mentioned your specific research focus. But I've suspected for months. Your last name, your interest in local history, the way you carry yourself in this building like you belong here. I started doing some research of my own. Roberto pulled out more documents from the folder. Thomas Williams wasn't just a founding member of this dining club, David. He was one of the primary investors who kept this place running during the Depression. His family had deep roots in this community, and they were respected business leaders for generations. David looked at the documents, seeing his family name repeated throughout the historical records.
I had no idea.
My family moved away when I was young, and we lost touch with a lot of our history. There's more, Roberto said, his smile growing wider. David, you're not just a server here. You're not even just a graduate student doing research. You're the great-great-grandson of one of the men who built this place. The implications were starting to sink in, and David felt a strange mix of emotions, pride, amazement, and something else. Something that felt like justice. Those people at table 12, David said slowly. They have no idea who they're talking to. No, Roberto said. They don't. But maybe it's time they found out. David stared at the historical documents spread across Roberto's desk, his mind racing as he processed what he'd just learned. The photograph of his great-great-grandfather seemed to stare back at him, and suddenly the familiar feeling he'd always had in this building made perfect sense. Roberto, I need to ask you something, David said, looking up from the papers. Why are you telling me this now? Why tonight? Roberto leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. Because those people at table 12 crossed a line tonight. I've been in this business for 20 years, and I know the difference between demanding customers and people who are treating someone badly because of who they think that person is. What they did to you wasn't about service standards. It was about something much worse. David nodded, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. I thought I could just get through it professionally and move on. You could have, Roberto said. And that would have been fine. But David, you don't have to just endure that kind of treatment. Not here, not anywhere, and especially not in a building that your own family helped create. Roberto gathered up the documents and handed them to David. I want you to take these back to table 12 with me, not as their server, but as someone who belongs here just as much as they do. More, actually. David felt his pulse quicken. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that those people need to learn something about making assumptions. They spent the entire evening treating you like you were beneath them, questioning your intelligence and your qualifications. They never bothered to actually find out who you are or what you know. Roberto stood up and straightened his tie. They wanted expertise and sophistication. Let's give them some real education. David looked down at the photograph of his great-great-grandfather one more time, then carefully gathered the documents. Okay, let's do this. As they walked back toward the dining room, David felt different. The nervous energy that had been plaguing him all evening was replaced by something calmer and more confident. He wasn't just a server who had been treated badly. He was Thomas Williams' great-great-grandson, a PhD candidate researching the very history these people claimed to value, and someone who had every right to be in this place. Table 12 was finishing their desserts when Roberto and David approached. The four guests looked up with expressions that ranged from annoyed to curious when they saw David returning with the manager. Folks, I hope you're enjoying your desserts, Roberto said pleasantly. I wanted to follow up on your earlier concerns and share something interesting with you. The first man set down his fork and looked at Roberto with the patient expression of someone humoring a service industry worker. We appreciate you handling the situation personally. The meal has been much better since you took over. I'm glad to hear that, Roberto said. But I realized there was a misunderstanding earlier that I'd like to clear up. You see, when you questioned David's qualifications and knowledge about this restaurant, I think you were operating with incomplete information. The woman with the shellfish allergy shifted uncomfortably. We weren't questioning anyone's qualifications. We just wanted good service. David stepped forward holding the folder of documents. Actually, you questioned whether I could read the menu, whether I understood what a sommelier was, and whether I had proper training. You also made comments about diversity programs and suggested that I wasn't qualified to work in an establishment like this. The four guests exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable at having their words repeated back to them so directly. Now, I could have just accepted those comments and moved on. David continued, his voice calm and measured. But I think you might be interested to know a little more about my background and my connection to this place. He opened the folder and pulled out the historical photograph. This building was constructed in 1923 as an exclusive dining club for local business leaders. The gentleman in the center of this photograph was one of the founding investors. The guests leaned forward to look at the photo, their curiosity evident despite their discomfort. His name was Thomas Williams, and he was my great-great-grandfather, David said, watching their faces change as the implications sank in. The Williams family helped establish many of the businesses that built this community, and they were respected leaders here for generations. The second man cleared his throat nervously. That's very interesting. It is interesting, David agreed. But there's more. You questioned my education and suggested I might not understand sophisticated cuisine. I'm actually a PhD candidate in local history, specializing in maritime commerce and economic development in coastal communities. I speak 3 languages, and I've been researching the very business relationships that created places like this restaurant. He pulled out another document from the folder. This is a historical record of the founding membership of the original dining club. You'll notice several familiar names from local businesses that still operate today. David set the document on the table where all 4 guests could see it. I know the history of every building in this historic district. I know how the fishing industry evolved into the tourism economy that brings visitors like yourselves here. And I know the stories of the families, including my own, who built this community. The first woman was staring at the documents with obvious shock. We had no idea. Of course you didn't, David said gently. Because you never asked. You made assumptions based on what you saw and decided that was all you needed to know. Roberto stepped forward. David didn't have to share any of this with you. He could have just continued providing excellent service despite how you treated him. But I thought it was important for you to understand that when you question someone's qualifications or intelligence, you might be talking to someone who knows more than you realize. The silence at the table was deafening. The 4 guests looked embarrassed, ashamed, and utterly speechless. Now, Roberto continued, David is going to finish taking care of you for the remainder of your evening. Not because he has to, but because he chooses to. Because that's the kind of person he is, and that's the level of service we provide here. David looked at each of the 4 guests. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the history of this place. If you have any questions about the local area or recommendations for other historical sites to visit, I'd be happy to help. After all, this is my community, and I'm proud to share it with visitors. The first man finally found his voice. David, we owe you an apology. Our behavior tonight was inexcusable. Thank you, David said simply. I accept your apology. The second woman was wiping tears from her eyes. We're ashamed of ourselves. We pride ourselves on being educated people, but we acted like ignorant fools tonight. We all make mistakes, David said. What matters is what we learn from them. As Roberto returned to his other duties, David finished serving table 12 with the same professionalism he'd shown all evening. But now the dynamic was completely different. The 4 guests asked thoughtful questions about the building's history, the local community, and David's research. They listened respectfully to his answers and treated him with the dignity they should have shown from the beginning. When they were ready to leave, the first man handed David a tip that was 3 times larger than normal. This doesn't make up for our behavior, he said quietly, but we hope you'll accept it as a small gesture of respect. The apology was enough, David said, but he accepted the tip graciously. After they left, several other diners approached David to compliment him on how he'd handled the situation. Word had spread throughout the restaurant about what had happened, and David found himself receiving congratulations from customers and staff alike. Carmen appeared at his side as he was clearing table 12. So turns out you're restaurant royalty, huh? David laughed, feeling lighter than he had all evening. I guess so, though I still have to finish my shift and clean this table. Some things never change, Carmen said with a grin. But David, what you did tonight was important. Those people needed to learn that lesson, and you taught it with more grace than they deserved. As the evening wound down, David reflected on what had happened. The painful experience with the tourists had led to an incredible discovery about his family's history and his own connection to the place where he worked. More importantly, it had shown him that he didn't have to accept disrespectful treatment from anyone, regardless of their money or social status. When his shift ended, David stood on the deck overlooking the harbor where his great-great-grandfather had once conducted business. The same ocean that had brought prosperity to his family generations ago was still there, still beautiful, still full of possibilities. Roberto joined him for a moment before leaving. "So how does it feel to know you're working in the family business?" David smiled, looking out at the lights reflecting on the water. "It feels like coming home." The next morning, David woke up to find that someone had posted a video online of part of the evening's events. One of the other diners had recorded his presentation of the historical documents and his dignified response to the tourists' behavior. The video went viral, with thousands of people praising David's grace under pressure and condemning the tourists' behavior. Within days, the story had spread across social media and news outlets. The restaurant received hundreds of positive reviews and requests for reservations. David was interviewed by local news stations about his research and his family's history in the community. But the most meaningful response came from his university, which offered him additional funding for his research and invited him to present his findings at an upcoming historical symposium. The tourists' attempt to diminish David based on their prejudices had backfired spectacularly. Instead of being silenced or humiliated, David had been elevated and celebrated. Their lesson in humility had become his moment of triumph. And at the Blue Pearl restaurant, David continued working while finishing his PhD, no longer just as a server, but as a proud member of a family that had helped build the community he was studying. The building that had once intimidated him now felt like home, and every table he served was a reminder that dignity and respect are earned through character, not granted through assumptions.